nothing I liked more than going into a movie and seeing somebody get their head ripped off. Woohoo, that was cool.
It's like a really rare map to a very dark forest.
Kill her, Mommy. I'm a 13-year-old transvestite killer.
There's something inherently sexual in every slasher movie.
Really good-looking people can get away with murder.
Jesus Skull called me despicable.
The worst of this disgusting bunch.
If you don't like the genre, boo-hoo.
I go strange places and I kill people.
Now that's what makes horror film.
And it'll always be with us.
Mankind's appetite for violence is as old as mankind itself.
The truth of the matter is the bloodlust in all of us.
The first sign they look for as far as human habitation in a landscape, which are going back like 20,000 years, is are there rocks that were made into edged weapons? That's one of the basic solutions to opening kind of the integument, the shell of some other living thing.
Earlier forms of art depict that in all of its grotesqueness.
We have a reptile brain way down inside, and that brain is cold-blooded, that part of the brain, and it kills, and it doesn't care.
Animals kill each other in order to eat, and humans have always killed each other.
Horror has been around forever.
Certainly, you go back like 5,000 years with the Odyssey, and it's full of monsters, the Cyclops.
The ancient Romans, you know, the thrill of watching people torn apart by animals. I mean, they would gather in mass to see something like that. You know? What was that fulfilling? What was that catering to?
They're human. There are hunters among us that hunt other humans for their own gratification. The darkness is in the human soul.
Kids being eaten and so on. It's been going on for centuries.
In the spring of 1897, man's taste for the macabre found a new level of splendor with the Paris opening of the Théâtre du Grand Guignol. And for the next 60 years, the original theater of horror brought scenes of rape, torture, and grotesque violent stunts to a voyeuristic live audience.
Thousands and thousands of plays, you know, were written and were very popular. Just eye gouging and, you know, faces in fire and burning at the stake and arrows through the, you know, there was something about wanting to see that happen to people.
With the increasing numbers of modern cinemas, the Grand Guignol closed its doors forever in 1962, after giving birth almost accidentally to a new genre. Perhaps it is no coincidence, and somehow fitting, that just 2 years earlier, two of Britain's most talented filmmakers had laid the foundations for the contemporary slasher film. Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, a sympathetic portrayal of a voyeuristic murderer, horrified audiences and critics alike, who failed to note the film's intelligent treatment of the subject. It would be 20 years before the film was finally hailed a classic example of British cinema, though it came far too late for Powell's career, which effectively came to an end with Peeping Tom's 1960 release. That same year, however, the genius of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho whet the appetite of the American audiences.
Because the American culture had changed. You had Ed Gein, who had murdered a lot of people.
I had no idea that Bloch had written his book about a real person. I read it and I thought, this is a strange thing for Hitchcock to do. He just sat there like this, you know, with his hands on his belly, and never moved, never blinked, never said a word. When I got to the point where she gets killed while she's in the shower, he said, we could get a star.
The thing about that movie is You know, as scary as it is, as scary as it is, the difference between that and what came later, there's no blood.
Horror movies changed after Psycho. It was kind of the granddaddy of all these films. Later, you see films that really nail you to the back of the theater.
But it wasn't until 1978 when the genre crescendoed into that one perfect note.
Halloween night. A small American town. 15 years ago. Michael? Halloween.
One of the things that I noticed that happened earlier was this Jim Jones business. This religious leader, he had all his followers, and they took Kool-Aid and died, and there was this kind of a bizarre feeling in the country that things weren't quite right. Carter was our president. He was an unpopular leader. So I think Halloween came around at the time people just wanted to have a safe scare. 78 was the right time.
Halloween.
Deborah and I worked together for many, many, many years. She worked on screenplays with me and produced for me.
Irwin Yablans actually came up with the idea of setting it in Halloween. And we were searching for a story, what could the story be? And because we were very limited, in fact, they wanted babysitters. So, and I'd been a babysitter, and I had all these great stories.
And they went out to London to meet with my father, and it was actually a very quick meeting. It was a quick sell. John really impressed him, told him that he would take no money, that he would do it for very cheap. I think it was $300,000 they ended up doing it for. John would direct, produce, write, do the score.
I grew up watching horror movies. And when I made Halloween, I just took all the lessons that I learned from what I had seen and what I'd love to see on the screen. We were just trying to make a movie, man. We had very little money. We had Donald Pleasance for 3 days.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Somebody's escaped from a mental institution and he's on the loose.
I consider the film to be a perfect film. Michael Myers is the hand of God. He's a force of nature. People look back on it, it's still considered one of the scariest films of all time. It is, at the end of the day, very light on gore.
There's maybe one scene where a character is pinned against a cabinet in the kitchen, and you see the knife sticking out, and it's all about Michael Myers sort of looking quizzically at this dead body.
Scariest moments come with the tilt of a head, or come with that great John Carpenter 2.35 scope format.
We made it with widescreen, Panavision, and tried to make it as elegant as possible.
But the crucial central performance is Jamie Lee Curtis's performance. It's brilliant. She looks like a human being. She creates a true character that the audience very strongly identifies with.
Deborah thought it'd be a great idea to cast her, plus the fact that she was Janet Leigh's daughter, which kind of connected back to Psycho.
Tommy, Halloween night, it's when people play tricks on each other. It's all make-believe. I think Richie was just trying to scare you.
Didn't matter if you lived in Poughkeepsie, didn't matter if you lived in Detroit, didn't matter if you lived in Los Angeles. Everyone had a babysitter. Most people were babysitters at one point or another. Everyone can relate to the terror of being faced with that faceless white mask.
Can't kill the boogeyman.
The thing I did to try to kick it up in the air was to make protagonist unkillable.
I think people underrate this to this day, how effective the ending of that film was.
The
The idea of leaving it open-ended and that Michael Myers was still out there when you left the theater, so that even people when they were walking up putting the keys in their house would stop and go,
Halloween was released in a regional release. In other words, the distributor wasn't big enough to do it nationwide, so it went from region to region. It was one of those underground films that really was not reviewed very well. And all the reviews that we had on Halloween were negative. But the review in Village Voice was all of a sudden a positive review, and it said this movie has something more to it. And it began to pick up because of word of mouth. So it gave me a little credibility.
It was just a really scary horror film that is considered a slasher film because it was very real and there was slashing in it.
It's always like the thing that exists before the name gets put on it would be Halloween, I guess. I mean, that, you know, is the single guy with a knife chasing teenagers.
It's a classic which spawned many afterwards, the way Star Wars or American Graffiti or Indiana Jones are. It's a template in the horror genre, so that makes it a classic.
Anytime a story has truly terrified us historically, it becomes history. Halloween is history.
And it made a fortune that turned Hollywood on its butt.
Friday the 13th is a film that's fully aware it's come after Halloween.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
The difference between that and Friday was the Friday guy said, we're going to let it rip, where these other guys didn't.
Never come back again. Oh, shut up, Ralph. It's got a death curse.
We run this ad in Variety. This is Friday the 13th, the most terrifying film ever made. The point of the ad was to see if anybody was going to sue us and if we could actually use the title Friday the 13th. But as it turns out, not only did we not get sued, but we got phone calls from distributors saying, we'd love to see this film. What is it? When can we see it? We didn't even have a script. So I have this ad and I have some money lined up and I have these guys in Boston that have decided that they want a bigger piece of the action and they want to put up all the money. I had a history with these guys and I just felt that they were taking too much of an edge. At some point you have to draw the line and say, no, what you're offering is very nice, but I don't want to do the deal. Well, then they said, all right. And they hung up and I said, gee, that's too bad. And I looked around, you know, and I've got 2 kids and I've got a wife and I've got this whole army of people that have been working on this thing for a long time. I had sort of had a sleepless night, and that morning I woke up early around 5 o'clock and I picked up the phone and I called this guy at home and I said, you know, I've thought about it overnight and I'll do the deal. And he said, who? I'm glad you called, because I was just leaving. I was on my way to Weymouth and I was going to take that money and put it in a shopping center. If indeed I had slept late that morning, it's quite likely the movie would never have happened.
Hey, wasn't that the road up for Camp Crystal Lake back there?
It's really sort of the first one that was excessively gory and gratuitous.
I'm close friends with Sean Cunningham, and his feeling was, forget all the social comment and everything else. Let's just be so outrageous that people won't be able to believe what they're seeing. So he went for that sort of arrow through the eyeball thing and everything, which was in its own way strangely subversive.
I've got this idea for a movie and it's going to have some special effects in it. We don't quite know how we're going to do it and where we're going to do it, and we need somebody. And I think one of us had seen Dawn of the Dead. Let's find out who did the effects on that. There must be somebody. And found Tom Savini, this madman. This guy with just explosive energy and laughing eyes and a chinchilla and a car full of stuff arrives in the driveway a day or two later and sort of bounds out and starts talking about how great this could be.
It's almost like a Romero film. Romero, before he starts a film, he calls me and he says, start thinking of ways to kill people.
And we invited him, you know, to work on the picture, and he just never went home.
We just sat around this conference table chatting about how to kill these teenagers.
Simplest one I can think of, the hatchet gag. I think my favorite gag was probably the Kevin Bacon gag, where the arrow comes up out of the neck.
When it cuts from the real Kevin Bacon to him lying there with the wife beater and necklace on the dummy, you don't make a separation. You're just following right along. So the arrow coming out was a big surprise. Well, the hand comes first, and then I'm pushing the arrow through the rubber dummy inside of an ice bag that's filled with blood. And the actual pressure of pushing the arrow against the ice bag full of blood forced the blood to come out. Plus, I got to spin the arrow a bit, twist it.
And the audience had never seen anything like that before.
Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees.
I've always approached a character with doing an autobiography. I can tell you the story about why Mrs. Voorhees is the way she is. One place in the script, there is a hand that has a high school ring on it, a male's high school ring. And we girls always wore the boys' class ring. That you went steady, but you didn't have a sexual relationship with the guy that you were in love with. They did make love. And she became pregnant. And she told him, he said, oh, don't brush it off on me, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, her father has a fit. You're a tramp. You have no business being a part of this family. Leave, get out, get out. So she leaves. She went to the Salvation Army, and that she had the baby there. And the night I came up, and when Tommy Savini was making the mock-up of my head, he was showing me some Polaroid pictures. And I said, well, who's this? And he said, oh, that's your son, Jason. I said, oh. And I said, well, why does he look so strange? And he said, well, he's a mongoloid. I said, he's what? And she takes this job at this camp so he can be with other children. And all the counselors are there, and they're off making love. Some where her little boy was swimming with the other campers. The kid drowns. Mrs. Voorhees is the perfect mother. Not only will she kill for her son, she'll die for him.
How could you chop off somebody's head on camera?
So having never done it, I couldn't figure out, I wanted it to happen right in front of you. I wanted you to see the machete and see the head come loose and go. And we actually fastened her rubber head to the rubber body that Tasso wore on his shoulders with toothpicks. That's the only way I can think of that a machete would cut through those toothpicks, and I wanted the head to flip when he got cut too. So I actually swung the machete, hit the right spot, and the toothpicks let go of the head and it flipped in the air. Notice when the head comes off and Betsy Palmer reaches up and grasps for the missing head, that there's hair on the knuckles, because it's my friend Tasso Stavrakis, this Greek man, and it's his hands coming up in the frame.
I think the secret that has happened with Friday the 13th, #1, is that you don't really see the killer killing. It's all that wonderful.
And there was a close-up of Betsy Palmer's mouth. And obviously she was a person who heard voices. She had voices in her head. And she heard Jason saying,
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
And only took the K and put an I there, so it was K. And then Mommy, which was Ma. And I went to a microphone, had something called an echoplex, and just went K, Ma, like that. And the echoplex would go K.
There was no ending to the in the script, so I had just seen Carrie. You know, in Carrie, at the end, you think the movie's over, the music is coming up, like the credits are going to roll, and all of a sudden the hand comes out of the grave. Well, that really jolted us.
Wouldn't it be cool if we had that kind of a moment at the end of Friday the 13th, but what could it be?
I suggested that we bring Jason back. Maybe he jumps out of the lake or something, you know.
What? But it'd be cool to have a moment. And Harry Manfredini starts playing this beautiful end title music.
The object of the ending was to tell the audience, well, this movie is over.
And we're seeing the girl on the lake, and you realize, oh, she's going to be okay.
When Jason came out of the water, popcorn was flying. People were jumping out of seats and screaming and yelling, and Sean was just like, I got him, I got him, I got him.
I think that moment, that boo moment, is one of the reasons why the film ultimately was so successful, because it just said, we're having fun. Are you? And everybody said, oh yeah, man, we're having fun. And they left with that. They left on a high. And suddenly, Paramount and Warner Brothers start bidding against each other. We decide that we're going to go with Frank Mancuso, who was head of distribution at Paramount at the time. And what he wanted to do was something completely different. He wanted to open it nationally.
You had a major studio behind a low-rent slasher film for the first time.
And the picture was an enormous success from day one.
Everyone was talking about it in the schoolyard, you know, talking about all the gruesome murders. And You know, that made everyone want to run back the next weekend to see it either again or for the first time to see what everyone was talking about.
I am still in awe that it has become what it has become.
You know, I never realized at the beginning that I would get enough money to be able to buy a place like this, you know, and call it my own.
Paramount made $40 million with Friday the 13th.
Jamie Lee Curtis's manager came to us and really made a plea for his client to have it. And I couldn't get over it the day he called because I'm thinking, it's Jamie Lee Curtis. She was in Halloween. I mean, she's done this. Why? So when she wanted to do it, I then had to go back to the producer who I'd been building up for this TV movie actress and say, forget her. Let's get Jamie. And quite honestly, I've always said, since the movie opened, that Jamie Lee was 75% of the success of that movie. As much as kids appreciated it and liked it, and as good a suspenser as it was Jamie Lee. Prom Night was conceived as more of a thriller than a horror film, and so it needed twists and turns. In order to achieve that, we took the route of the brother being the killer.
Come on, they don't want you in their game.
Kim's youngest sister is chased through a building by a group of her fellow kids. Her brother sees them terrorize the sister, but before he can do anything, the young girl falls out a window. He sees her crash to her death. Later, when the police come and everything, he's taken back home, but he's always held it in him. Finally, on the night of the prom, he decides it's time to get revenge and make these kids pay. I think it's a good movie. Well, Paramount did too, as it turned out. They talked to the producer seriously about distributing it. The producer talked to a couple of other studios, one which was Avco Embassy, that really wanted it badly. They made a much better deal with Peter, the producer, than Paramount was willing to do, particularly on the back end. Paramount, seeing, I guess, the potential in this, went looking for a film of their own and came up with Sean Cunningham's Friday the 13th. The big difference between the two films was that Paramount could afford to put out 1,200 prints on Friday the 13th, and we did 300 at Avco and bicycled them back and forth, so we didn't do quite as well, but I must say we did great.
Hollywood took notice of the financial success of Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Prom Night, and with audiences eager to spend their money, a slew of slasher films were born.
Anybody that gets in at the beginning with a good film of the cycle, be it horror, be it slasher, has a good chance of succeeding.
And this inspired guys to think, well, he can make a film that doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and he can get it before thousands of movie screens and probably make a lot of money. I got a call from the producer, or at least investor, and I went to a penthousey kind of apartment. And he was like laying on a couch. All he had on was boxer shorts. He had white boxer shorts open in the front. Okay, and he was laying on the couch. He was an old guy with long gray hair, looked like Howard Hughes in The Last Moments. He just thought this would be a really good movie.
We came up with this idea, which we pitched to these two producers, Edgar Lansbury and Joe Beru. I described the fact that the girl gets out of the car, walks around, finds him hanging upside down from a tree with his throat slit, and his ring is tapping against the window. And she screams, and the guy with the hook comes out and starts chasing her. And they're still not impressed. So then I said, we pull back, and we're in a theater, and we're watching this on the screen, and the real killer's in the theater, and he's gonna kill somebody in there. And they went, oh, wow, that's good. When MGM bought the movie, they brought on a publicist named Ira Teller, who decided to do a whole campaign, design the campaign for the film. And he called me one day, and he says, I came up with a title for your film. And I was excited. I was expecting something really brilliant. And he says, He Knows You're Alone. And I went, And I thought, wow, isn't that like a tagline?
By the end of 1980, the slasher genre was firmly established with a clear blueprint to follow.
Formula being teenagers being threatened by a guy in a mask or a killer of some sort, usually with a knife that slashes.
The boogeyman is the faceless, unstoppable killer that no matter what you do, you will not escape.
All the dark things that you're afraid of, you get behind those masks and behind that darkness that it comes out of. And you know it is stronger than you.
We usually see him from a point of view shot, POV shot, right from the start.
You know from the genre, it's not going to be easy to outsmart the thing.
They want to have been in that place. So whether it is a high school in Prom Night or a suburb in Halloween, they know it. And therefore, the terror, whatever it may be, whether it is from their own family, whether it is an outside terror, whatever, can prey upon them in an environment they know and they feel safe in.
The final girl in these little morality tales is the person who has embodied the moral code that society thinks it allows you to go forward in life.
The virtuous, the virginal one, who's the final girl at the end, it's up to her to defeat the evil.
Something that triggers a series of killings.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed?
He's got some kind of twisted backstory.
Kiss me. Kiss me.
What are you talking about?
Kenny Hampson, you're stunned with the corpse?
Well, nobody do that for a goddamn prank.
It wasn't just a prank. Doc, he was sick. No. I'm so sorry.
You haven't changed.
How does he kill? What does he do? Does he strangle people? Does he talk them to death? Does he tell them jokes?
And it's never a gun, right? I mean, sure, wouldn't the movie be over after the first frame? 8 kids, bang, 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 8 times, they're gone. It's more fun to terrorize them and, hit them with a spear or a release or an umbrella or like a screwdriver. That's where the excitement comes from. How is the next one going to get it? And you look forward to that. So that's part of the paradigm. It has to have that if we're talking about what a slasher movie is.
You have all these elements, so that core audience knows when they go to see a slasher film, the conventions are going to be there, they're going to feel familiar to them, and they're going to enjoy themselves.
In need of new ways to shock their devotees, filmmakers turn to Italian cinema for inspiration.
Friday the 13th Part 2 had taken, some of that. And it's completely you know, understandable. These are amazing horror movies, and who hasn't stolen? Bava is definitely the godfather of Italian cinema, of horror cinema, absolutely. I mean, the films are just, you know, they come off the screen at you with, like, as though you're on a canvas being, you know, the paint being thrown at you. I just absolutely love Dario Argento's visuals, the acting, the look of the characters, and Suspiria is just one of my favorite films.
All of those films that basically not only celebrated blood and celebrated gore, made it, in a weird way, part of the artistic palette.
It went through this wave of Halloween, where we didn't see a lot of graphic blood and gore, through Friday the 13th, and then the beginning of the slasher era.
Up in Canada, it was sort of like Slasher Central because of the tax laws. They were able to do these films cheaper, and they were like instantly profitable before the films even came out, it seemed. They probably opened up a calendar and tried to find a holiday or date to exploit.
From the heart comes a warning filled with bloody good cheer. Remember what happened as the 14th draws near.
Now, we started thinking about which kind of character can be a killer that can be masked. So we started looking at crafts, and we ended up with a miner. A miner has got a helmet on, he's got a breathing apparatus, he's got a pick.
My Bloody Valentine is one of the more vicious of the slasher films from this period. It's pretty gory, it's nasty and mean-spirited, and that film took no prisoners.
We've been dealing with Paramount, so they came down and we showed them the film. They went out of the screening room in shock. Frank said, "We're not taking this film unless you get an MPAA rating, but it's up to you to get it." Jack Valenti hated the idea of major studios being involved in slasher films, and he wanted to punish Paramount, and he also wanted to punish us as Canadian carpetbaggers who were coming down to the U.S. to cash in on this genre.
Despite the R rating, Valentine went on to become a slashing success.
Again, we looked in the calendar, and we couldn't find anything that would do for a horror film, a slasher.
My birthday's Sunday, and I'd like to invite you to dinner.
So we said, okay, let's do it on birthday. We needed a girl lead. And we focused in on Melissa Sue Anderson, who was popular with her TV series. She wanted to play against type. She was tired of being Miss Prissy Two Shoes and wanted something with meat in it. And then we were able to get a cameo out of Glenn Ford. We told Gersh that, well, we're getting ready for Happy Birthday. And he said, why don't you speak to Jay Lee? And I said, how could we ever get Jay Lee? I mean, Guns of Navarone and everything. He says, yeah, but he's done some thrillers. I said, well, okay, well, let him read the script. So he came aboard. We almost fell on the floor. But his problem was he kept screaming for blood, more blood. And we had to tone him down because he was running around with throwing blood all over the place, and it was obscuring the killings and everything else. You cut a guy's head in a motorcycle chain, and you throw a gallon of blood in there, it's all over the camera, it's all over the crew.
Happy Birthday to me is kind of fun, and the thing that's unique about it is that the heroine winds up being the killer.
At the end, there's this big birthday party with all the corpses are all surrounded. She's having her birthday party. But the thing is that she is innocent because it was one of the other girls, and that's where we did that ending that some people liked and some people hated it. One of the girls of the 7 was killing, and she had a mask that looked like Melissa Sue. Columbia didn't get behind it as much as Paramount did with Bloody. The reason that they came into this was that the strike was looming Hollywood, and all the studios were getting worried about product if the strike was going to be a long term. We insisted in the deal with Columbia that we get consult on the advertising. And we met the head of advertising, shows us the skewer in the guy's mouth, and he says, this is our ad campaign. We said, well, did you have 2 or 3 others that we could look at? No, we decided on this. So we said, yeah, but we got consulting. And he said, well, you've been consulted, goodbye.
We went to see Halloween, Friday the 13th, and we just saw how these things were constructed. And if you watch carefully, and you watch it several times, you see that you have to have your build-up to a horror activity, to some kind of massacre, and then it continues on. And they all had to fit that particular pattern. You know, we did take a stopwatch, and I forgot how many minutes there was. You've got to have something, you know, to fit that genre. It's a total divide when you're making a horror film as opposed to when you're watching it, and then when you're watching an audience. And if you've seen Graduation Day, we have a major decapitation, which is a pretty grotesque thing. But while you're doing it, you're really involved with the mechanics and the technique. And then when you watch an audience, it kind of blows you away, which is one of the reasons, by the way, I must admit that I don't do horror films anymore. It was a little too scary for me to be in the audience of a real horror film like Graduation Day and see some of the reactions. I mean, what it unleashes was truly scary. There's a great expression in Hebrew, which is, it was good, but it's good that it was.
I'm gonna have to teach you too.
Yes, it was an homage to Psycho, keeping Laura's body preserved, using it as a scare tactic. We all went out. We had hundreds of people in caps and gowns, and that was very effective ploy. And it was very easy to get a whole high school out with black caps and gowns and the badge that said, you know, I survived Graduation Day.
There's a whole line of these titles. Every holiday ever practically got covered.
My feeling was that for a while, it was the special effects that were driving those films. Then suddenly people started rooting for the killer. They wanted to see people murdered because they wanted to see what it would look like, how the special effect would be accomplished.
And special effects artists like Tom Savini satisfied those cravings.
He just knows how to make that stuff work, and particularly when we were willing to be excessive. Because we didn't have to censor, you know, like his twisted mind.
I used to get so scared when I saw these movies when I was a kid. And it just made me want to scare people.
So I shined shoes in my neighborhood just to buy makeup supplies. I was stealing lipsticks on my mother's purse, anything to like screw up my face and do makeup. I went to the photo school and they sent me to Vietnam. So my job was to photograph damage to people and machines. And I saw some hideous stuff. I walked over a severed arm one day, and it was grabbing the ground. The muscles had contracted, it was grabbing the ground. And I studied the viscera on the end of it, thinking I got to create this someday, you know? To me, they're magic tricks. They're ways for me to fool people. If you're using a rubber weapon, give it some substance first. Smack something, plant it in a door so you see that this metal blade has taken a big chunk out of the door. So when the rubber one hits the person, you still think it's you still get the same feeling of the big metal one.
Super effective, disgusting, you know, vile film, yeah, and but that's what it's supposed to be, so that's why it's good.
I think most of the girls were like porno stars in that film, weren't they? I think they were, weren't they?
Even the burning, you know, I remember the effects in those films were great. That whole scene on the boat where the killer shows up with the shears and kills everybody.
He's nuts. He's absolutely crazy, but he's brilliant. He sees the effect as if he is, in fact, the killer.
What is my fascination with thinking of ways to kill people? I do feel like an assassin sometimes. When I go see my movies, I don't watch the movie. I really try to pick somebody out in the audience, and I watch the evolution of their heart attack.
The Prowler, I felt, came out right at that sort of peak of the splatter genre.
That's my best stuff, I think. There's no precedent for a lot of the stuff that we create, especially in these slasher films, so the fun is inventing how to do it. There's some pretty juicy stuff, especially the end with blowing Farley Granger's head off. So, we cast Farley Granger's head, and I built this dummy, and we filled it with, apple cores and shrimp dip and blood bags, and took it off with a real shotgun. There is a lot of darkness to the art.
By 1981, the audiences couldn't get enough gore.
Every weekend, it seemed like there was a new slasher film coming out. Stuff like Splatter University and Pieces and Don't Go in the Woods. Every independent producer and his brother were making these films on their own, churning them out and flooding the market. The New Lions were getting involved, and all these other companies that don't even exist anymore, like World Northful. The budgets got smaller, and they weren't as sophisticated.
Sleepaway Camp, you talk to kids that watch that original movie, and there is one thing and one thing only that they will remember. And I swear to God, I am convinced to this day, Neil Jordan saw that movie as a kid, and when he did the crying game, said, I'm ripping off Sleepaway Camp. It is the idea that that girl has a penis. And my God, one of the single greatest reveals in the history of the genre. And to this day, as bad as the sequels are, that moment is one of the great holy shit moments.
Guy was wearing a mold of my face standing there nude. He had to be 18 to do nudity. He had to be small enough to have the same shaped body as me. I was a small 13-year-old, little thin face. They found a guy, he got wasted, and he did the scene. Like, I had no concept at that age, like, what? I was playing what? No one really told me. I went and saw it and went, whoa, at the end, like everyone else. I was the chick with the dick.
That moment, weirdly enough, affected me more, particularly dating-wise. I didn't trust women for a long time after that, but that's a separate documentary. And the worst of these movies, the movies that have absolutely no redeemable value, are not well-made films, it doesn't matter, because there's something there, even in an awkward performance, that makes you love it.
He's dead, all right. No kidding. He's so cold. Is the pizza? Oh. Well, life goes on after all.
Slumber Party Massacre is at the end of the first cycle. In other words, the classics of Friday the 13th and Halloween and what they spawned was reaching an end. So Slumber Party Massacre does spoof those and is more comedic than they are.
So many critics attack the slasher films for being misogynistic.
When people criticized me for doing Slumber Party Massacre, I just thought they were full of it, to be perfectly honest. And I think that the film is not sexist, is based on an underlying fear that's very interesting and very female, which is about getting, laid for the first time.
However, despite the filmmaker's intention, the genre became an easy target for critics.
Yeah, I think slasher films are considered one notch above pornography in a lot of people's minds, and subversive and dangerous.
Run if you must.
Hello, operator.
Hide if you can. Scream if you are able, but above all, if you are alone. don't answer the phone.
TV commercials like that one exploiting the plight of women in danger, those ads have been saturating television for the past 2 years.
These films are coming out week after week, playing to millions of people, and the dominant image in American films today on women is not founded in Clayburgh. It's women like that, cowering in the corner, knives being brandished in their faces, being raped, being sliced apart. That's what's going on in American movies. That's why we're doing this show.
Horror films, way back when the women were fainting and not able to cope with anything and they had to be rescued by a man, is a social statement.
A Psycho, you have a victim there.
And at the point when those of us that make the films started realizing, wait a minute, that's really bullshit, and started making heroines that were strong.
The killer in these slasher films is definitely not always the male.
Many more guys die on camera than women. Women do get killed, but very, very few get killed on camera. The really bloody deaths in the film are the guys.
These films hate women, and unfortunately, the audiences that go to them don't seem to like women too much either.
It's amazing how many preteen and teenage girls rent these movies and watch them and love them.
And to sit there surrounded by people who are identifying not with the victim, but with the attacker, with the killer, who are cheering these killers on, is a very scary experience.
Nobody wants to see her hurt. Because you're playing to fear, that is the emotion of horror movies, is fear. You're trying to evoke that and put the audience through it in a visceral way. That doesn't mean the audience wants to see her get hurt. That's a complete misunderstanding of the genre. They want to see her in jeopardy and triumph and get revenge.
Here's one of the ads for the Boogeyman.
You can't hide from him.
I'm convinced it has something to do with the growth of the women's movement in America in the last decade. I think that these films are some sort of primordial response by some very sick people of men saying, get back in your place, women. These women in the films are typically portrayed as independent, as sexual, as enjoying life, and the killer typically, not all the time, but most often, is a man who is sexually frustrated with these new, aggressive women.
Young girls who wind up being the victims are the ones who've just had sex, you know, and they're being punished in some way. Gosh, if anything, that would turn me against that convention, because I believe just the opposite.
I don't think it's demeaning to women. I don't think it's demeaning to anything. It's an art form.
And so he strikes back at them. He throws knives at them. He can't deal with them. He cuts them up. He kills them. Get back in your place. It's against the women's movement.
There's something inherently sexual in every slasher movie. What is wrong with there being something inherently sexual?
Horror movies always have been and will be sort of like the dirty secret that everybody wants to ignore. It doesn't matter how many of them open at #1, how many of them are huge mega hits, how many of them, it doesn't matter. They always want to sort of treat it that way.
They're critics, and they need a line. They need something to take them in and go, what is it that I can criticize? Well, the easiest genre in the world to criticize is the horror genre. And if you want to be even more specific, the slasher genre, because to a critic, what is the value? Well, what's valuable about it is that it allows people to experience their humanity. Critics, for some reason, don't understand that. Maybe most of them have not allowed themselves to really experience their humanity.
Ladies and gentlemen, in order to achieve an R rating today, a motion picture must contain full frontal nudity, graphic violence, or an explicit reference to the sex act. Since this film has none of those, and since research has proven that R-rated films are by far the most popular with the movie-going public, the producers of this motion picture have asked me to take this opportunity to say, fuck you.
Unfortunately for the genre, critics gained a major ally.
Our kids are all learning to trust Santa Claus. They don't have any fairy tales left.
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there.
And they say on the commercial that it only looks like Santa Claus, but to a child, there is only one Santa Claus.
You've made it through Halloween. Now try and survive Christmas. Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Silent Night, Deadly Night became the flashpoint, igniting protests across the nation.
We always want to put the responsibility on somebody else, don't we? We're ready to say, I didn't do that, it was their kid, or it was that mother. Take the responsibility. You're watching television. I have a lot to say about people who let their kids watch TV.
I think went wrong was the promo. If the promo had done no Santa Claus whatsoever, but had taken maybe the child who is terrified.
Christmas Eve is the scariest damn night of the year. I'd be scared too, if I was you.
The Mother Superior who says, when he draws a picture for the class of a Santa Claus killing, but when we do something naughty, we are always caught. And then we are punished. Punishment is absolute. Punishment is necessary. And when she says naughty, naughty. Very, very naughty. If they had done something like that and shown how the boy got twisted, if the promo had been just that, it would have been wonderful. Somebody got carried away with an idea. Wouldn't it be sensational to have a picture and advertise with Santa Claus? Never, ever thinking of the repercussion. Putting the Santa Claus in it gave advantage to the people who saw the promo. Sure, the public has a right to have an opinion. I don't think you have the right to impose your opinion on somebody else.
If I was watching television with my daughter and I saw a commercial with a killer Santa Claus or a killer Easter Bunny, I would feel that it was my job as the parent to sit down with my daughter or my son and talk about it. And then I would talk, elaborate about how this is fiction and explain, what kind of entertainment we're watching when we turn the television on. It's responsibility, and it starts in the home. Rather than call the president of TriStar and complain.
We're not out to do this to be famous or anything. We're out to get the movie taken out of the theater.
I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
But TriStar caved in by canceling the ads and eventually pulling the film from theaters.
The people that control making films being corporations. That filmmaking is just some tiny little part of what they do, but basically what they do is make money and they make product. And they make products that they can't get sued for. So it puts horror films amongst those of us that really like them in a very dangerous position where you can be legislated against.
Fearing similar wrath, Paramount was in the midst of killing its own beast.
And I started taking meetings about Friday the 13th. And it was very strange because I was really excited about doing Final Chapter, but I got a sense that people were a little embarrassed by it. They said, we don't want to get yelled at by any more shareholders at meetings and stuff. Kill the beast.
And of course, we started to think of ways to kill people again. And the most important one was Jason's death. We'll have Tommy just smack Jason in the side of the head with his machete, but let's go further and have him roll down the blade. He says, well, how are we gonna do that? Well, I don't know. We'll think of a way, and we did it. And in fact, as we were creating it, a guy put his hand in the head and put his finger out there, and I said, oh yeah, let's put a tongue in there. So the guy wore a tongue on his finger and had his head inside the head, making Jason's tongue go, because we couldn't possibly do that to a real person. And boy, did they love that in the theater. I mean, they were on their feet screaming when he slid down that blade.
I've heard that idea that Tommy Jarvis is an homage to Tom Savini. I was not thinking about Savini in any way. Savini had a lot to do with that movie, but nothing to do with Tommy Jarvis. But you couldn't help thinking, because, you know, the kid was obsessed with things that Savini's obsessed with. In fact, all the masks in Tommy's room are Savini's crap that he has laying around the garages here and there.
Although Jason made a killing at the box office, the genre seemed to have difficulty in luring its victims to theaters.
Fatigue was starting to set in.
You'd kind of seen it all before, and it just didn't feel fresh.
We were ready for a more sophisticated slasher film. We wanted to see it elevated.
This guy, he's after us in our dreams.
Had saved these clippings of the news story about some young men dying in the middle of severe nightmares. His father was a physician and had given him sleeping pills, and the kid supposedly was taking them, and they had come out of Southeast Asia war camps, so the family just assumed that he had been traumatized. And he said, no, it's different. There's something stalking me in my dream. I don't want to sleep. And he actually kept himself alive, or awake.
You didn't sleep at all last night, did you? You know, the doctor says you have to sleep or you'll go even crazier.
And finally he fell asleep, and the family, carried him up to his bed and put him to bed. And the accounts afterwards, we were all relieved and felt like finally he can rest and sleep. And they went to their own beds and then heard screaming and, thrashing, and they ran into his room, and he was just screaming, kicking on his bed. And by the time they got to him, he just fell silent and he was dead. And I just, then they found in his closet there was a coffee pot that he had hidden in there with black coffee, and they found all the sleeping pills. He hadn't taken any. And it was so dramatic. It was like, holy shit, this guy knew he was going to die if he slept. And you have to sleep.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
How terrifying is that?
In this case, this was a story about dreamers who, if they didn't wake up, which was very difficult to do with Freddy, they would be killed in their dreams, and there was going to be one hero, or heroine in this case, whose task was to figure out how to clear Freddy out of her life and out of the lives of all children without going to sleep.
Well, I'd sent the script all around to Hollywood. Everybody in Hollywood thought it was either dumb or too scary or not scary enough. I have a whole stack of wonderful letters that I keep, just to remind myself when things go rough. I got to say, to Bob's credit, is that he's the only person that I ran into that got it. And he got it right away, which I think is a real tribute to the man.
Difficulty was that since the bank wouldn't loan us money to make this movie, I had to not only undertake to develop the script, which I did, but then go out and try to raise the financing. You start off with a director and a script, but 8 weeks before you begin principal photography, all of a sudden there's 50 people working. You've got hairdressers and set designers and production coordinators and all kinds of other people, and they all have to be paid. So we had to pay them out of our own pocket solely on my belief that we could somehow pull this financing together. It was extremely harrowing and anxiety-provoking, all the bad stuff you want to experience watching a movie but not have in real life, because I couldn't wake up from it. It was just there every morning. Wes and I never could settle on an ending. Wes sort of thought I wanted Freddy driving the car because I wanted to have a sequel, but I wasn't even that sophisticated. So Wes and I continued to argue about this ending over and over and over. We had like 3 different endings that we shot. And we tested one, and then tested the other, and tested the third. None of them really were particularly satisfactory. What we finally decided to do, because different audiences had different points of view, is to end the film with all 3 endings. It wasn't satisfactory, but the audience seemed to like it. And I recall showing my father the movie, and he's said, it's a really good movie, really exciting and scary and stuff. And there's a kind of a pause in our conversation. He said, but you know, I don't like that ending. I said, well, Dad, we tried everything. We've done every kind of ending. I mean, we tried everything. He said, I don't care, you're gonna screw up this movie. Don't end it that way. After we finished the film, we showed it to Frank Mancuso and the other people at Paramount. They called me up and said, we're sorry, we don't want to take this film because audiences are not interested in movies about dreams. So by default, we had to move ahead and distribute the film on our own. I remember driving by a big theater on Broadway in New York on opening night, and there was lines around the block. I'd never seen that with any of our films. It seemed to have worked.
Come to Freddie.
What Freddie holds in my heart is Robert Englund, who's a terrific trooper, a very good actor, a gentleman, and a certain amount of a scholar. So, and also I feel the same about Wes.
I mean, the whole thing of Nightmare on Elm Street really was based on Eastern philosophy that I was studying at that time. Most of us are down, you know, at the bottom level where, you know, we go about our daily lives and everything else, but we don't think about a lot of things. And then next up is, you know, like businessmen, and then there's artists, and then there's mystics, and then at the very, and the farther up you go, the more uncomfortable it is. Just before the top, you get to the point where you either commit suicide, or you go back down, or you break through into real enlightenment. But you have to take, at that point, total responsibility for consciousness. That was kind of what I built that whole thing around. And sleep, by that, is the paradigm of not being conscious. So in order to be conscious, the most primal thing she had to do was stay awake. With some slasher films, I think it's just blood and guts and torture and things like that, which are pretty reliably upsetting, but I think kind of a cheat, you know. To me, it's much more about the social, economic, psychological zeitgeist of what's going on in the culture at the time that I try to get at.
The culture of the 80s had left its indelible mark on art and film, and in particular, on the landscape of the slasher genre.
I think it kind of points to generational aspects. The best horror is usually related to really turbulent times. It's a reflection of society on the whole.
You were in the Cold War and the atom bomb, and everybody was building shelters. Maybe the people were very uncertain about their future. It was escapism. I mean, if you're going to die a radioactive death, maybe you might get a kick out of watching somebody get head cut off in a movie theater. I don't know.
I mean, how can anyone be serious about anything when some moron can steal a bomb or push a button and nuke us all until our shadows glow?
I became shocked at the change in my country in the 80s when Reagan came in.
Excess, you know, everybody, you know, living off credit cards and wanting to see more. And now, I mean, there was a time when the old horror films, which to me are still the best, was where you didn't see everything. You know, what happened behind closed doors, it was suggested, and you had your mind completed it, and your mind completes it more horribly than, you know, the effects guys can create it. But now we want to see the heads blow off. We want to see the blood. In fact, the kids are disappointed, the audience is disappointed if they don't see it.
The pressures of AIDS coming in.
There's an unknown enemy who's out to get us. And I think, you know, certainly that plays out in the horror slasher genre because you don't know who the killer is, which I think is very much similar to, you know, the virus. I mean, you know, it doesn't have a face.
It was a pretty weird time. It showed how people can be, how frightened people are underneath.
The idea of these kids having this unprotected sex, setting themselves up for God knows what, and the idea of Jason as the fist of God, punishing these kids for their drinking, their drugs, and their sexuality.
I wonder if that works. Do you think kids are out there saying, ooh, I better not smoke this joint or fuck my girlfriend?
At the same time, the Halloween series, coming off of the area it's coming off of, is playing on this kind of, in many ways, the white flight of suburbia, and that nothing can touch you in suburbia once you've left the big city. Well, just wait, Michael Myers is coming to town. And then when you get to Nightmare on Elm Street is all about the internalization of teenage desires in many ways. And so those films were really reflecting the culture. And you're post-Vietnam, the country's moving more conservative. Jason and the Friday the 13th films are in many ways the most Reagan-era film series, with the exception probably of Rambo. You are paying for the sins of youth.
A lot of the excesses that you saw in violence was a response to the body culture. Everybody was exercising, and there's a lot of emphasis on looks and perfection and beauty. And the horror filmmaker said, oh yeah, I'll shake you up. And they just ripped it apart. it struck a chord in humans.
Horror movies before that, the metaphors had gotten old. If you take, for example, the Wolfman sort of the metaphor, that's about fear of one's own bestiality, or the 50s science fiction movies, which were about the fear of science and how that could get out of control. I think in the 80s, there was a new perception that the enemy was ourselves, that the worst possible enemy was another human who had gone crazy and whose motive was not rational, who could just come out of the blue and kill you.
But there was generally a new apathy in the public about it. And I can't remember her name, it was in New York. She was getting murdered and set on fire outside an apartment building. And everybody inside didn't come and help her. And it was a deadening of the spirit.
That was very prevalent in the 80s. There was a lot of serial killer publicity and a lot of sense of children being kidnapped, or, you know, the villain was real. The villain was not supernatural. The villain was a human being, and a human being was as scary as it could get. Corporate America capitalized on those fears by unleashing Freddy and his disciples through sequels and merchandising.
It opened the floodgates, because then there was Part 2, Part 3, Part 4 of Nightmare on Elm Street, and then somebody said, wait, horror's hot again. Who else can we resurrect? What's Leatherface been up to? What's Michael Myers been up to?
You'd go one summer and there would be a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie, a new Friday the 13th film, a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie.
By far, of the 3 major franchises, the most controversial of any of them. Not smartly thought up, Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, which basically takes you through an entire film thinking, I'm getting Jason, I'm getting Jason, I'm getting Jason. Oh, it's the guy driving the ambulance whose fat son got hacked up over a candy bar in the first 5 minutes of the movie. Shockingly, that didn't work.
In haste to make money, Friday the 13th Part 5 was not the only film that fooled the audience.
April Fool.
It was never intended to be a serious genre piece, and they sold it as a genre piece, and the genre fans came out to see it the opening weekend.
Oh, ha, ha. Ha, 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 ha! That's really funny, you guys! Really funny.
When it's revealed at the end that the entire movie never happened, because it was either a dream or a joke or something like that, you always, the audience, myself included, feels robbed.
They were completely disappointed because it was not a slasher picture, and the film tanked.
A lot of people that don't like April Fool's Day and they think it's a cheat, okay? I'm sorry. I will tell anybody, and I'm going to get in trouble with the hot tension filmmakers, that's a cheat. Okay, April Fool's Day is a pretty smart setup. It's kind of, you know, a nice little pull the rug out from under you.
If this contributed at all to the genre going into decline, okay, I'll take responsibility. No, I won't. I'm blaming the people at Paramount. Those marketing people, they're the ones who messed us up. That's life, you know, what can you do?
While Paramount had fooled its audience, New Line's Freddy Krueger started to become foolish himself.
TV show, games, T-shirts, masks. The horror icons were being mass marketed to middle America, which was quite a sight to see.
The studios are in the business to make money.
We're not going to have the Michael Myers cartoon, or, you know, although I should say it's not a bad idea.
Before long, audiences started to grow a little weary.
As Friday the 13th ran on, they almost slowly, more slow than usual, I would say, descended again into self-parody.
Freddy's wisecracks were wearing a little thin.
Want some face?
No.
We'll see, bitch. Bon appetit, bitch.
By the end of the decade, the Reagan era of greed had come to an end, and in the process, had bled the slasher genre dry. As the genre descended into obscurity, in its dying wake, it gave life to many careers.
A lot of people's first movie is a horror movie. I think they always make money, or they're always, you know, that's the choice they make.
I was casting this film. I see this guy pop his head in the door. He says, I'm a little early. Should I wait out here? And I said, no, come on in, sit down. And I had a sandwich, and he seemed like such a nice guy. And he kept looking down at the sandwich. Do you want a piece? And he said, sure. And he took it, and he started eating the sandwich with me. He only worked about a week and a half on the film. And he calls me and he says, I got to read for this pilot. And he got it. It was Bosom Buddies.
The Burning will probably be remembered for launching the film careers of Harvey and Bob Weinstein.
They come up to visit me on the set of Maniac, but that's the first thing they saw that Harvey and Bob Weinstein saw me create, and they were floored by, wow. It was Jason Alexander with hair, and he was just as funny on that movie as he is today. He was always cracking jokes. He had a very realistic delivery. I kind of liked that guy. And, Holly Hunter, I went to college with Holly Hunter, and she went right from that to being, I think, in the background of The Burning.
Nightmare on Elm Street, for example, obviously the original film is best known for Johnny Depp getting pulled in the bed and a geyser of blood shooting up afterwards. Kevin Bacon, everyone obviously knows from the original Friday, but that's almost the most fun about going back and looking at these movies.
For almost 7 years, the genre lied seemingly dead. But by mid-90s, a new generation of audiences were ready to breathe life into the beast.
When Silence of the Lambs came out and won Best Picture, and nobody ever wanted to refer to Silence of the Lambs as a horror movie because at that point horror was kind of taboo. They said, oh, it's a psychological thriller. Wait a minute, you're talking about a guy going around killing women and skinning them to make a suit out of human flesh. If that's not a horror movie, I don't know what is. And then all of a sudden, the genre is revitalized again with Scream.
Hello?
That idea of lifting a movie's plot out of the sort of formulaic and making it about the new reality, in a sense, was that every kid was media savvy and every kid knew all about horror films. So if you try to make a horror film where somebody says, I don't know what that sound was, but I'll go investigate, if somebody in the room doesn't say, well, that's from Halloween or whatever, then it becomes false.
Who's there? I'm calling the police.
You should never say who's there. Don't you watch scary movies? It's a death wish. You might as well just come out here to investigate a strange noise or something.
He took a formula and he added a little twist to it. And of course, with the Scream films, the twist was the killer is actually someone who's a fan of those movies and quizzes his victim.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
And if his victims know the horror genre, then they're fine. If they don't know the horror genre, they become his next victim.
Afraid not? No way.
Listen, it was Jason. I saw that movie 20 goddamn times!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel. I'm afraid that was a wrong answer.
There's something so horrible about the way she's being played with that it sets up who the killer is for the whole rest of the movie, and it gives you a motor that never stops.
Scream impressed me as being one of the first films that associated slasher with humor.
Wes is such an intelligent man. He's got a really unique sense of humor. He really knows how to manipulate the audience and how to lull them into a false sense of security.
The key factor for a good slasher movie is that it fulfills the requirements of the genre but surprise you in a way that a previous one has not done. Scream is probably a great example of that because it fulfills every single requirement at the same time making you laugh at every single requirement. You laugh at them, but you want to succumb to them, and so you do. I think Scream is probably one of the best ever made for that reason, because it combines both fear and horror in its own self-knowledge.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin, it's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Scream probably was one of the first instances where a horror film, a slasher film, had recognizable stars. You know, Drew Barrymore was a star, and Neve Campbell was a huge television star.
The idea in the 80s of a Courtney Cox coming off the highest rated show on network television to do a Scream was unheard of.
Dimension Films, Bob Weinstein was willing to go out and pay somebody some serious money to be in the film. That really made those films take a big jump towards being large successes. Those two women alone brought in a huge audience, you know, and a female audience.
So, how's the book? Well, it'll be out later this year. Oh, I'll look for it. I'll send you a copy.
For a whole new audience beyond the usual slasher base of fans, it was a new thing. It was scary. It was entertaining. It set the genre on its head.
Whoop, horror's hot again.
But they weren't your father's horror film. This was a whole new breed of slasher film. There was definitely a slickness in films like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend. You wouldn't get in a film like New Year's Evil or Pieces.
Now, every horror movie you see come out is going to have some recognizable television star, and those television stars smartly realize I can increase my foreign value from these movies. I can show people, you know, I call it the Sarah Michelle Gellar theorem, in that Sarah Michelle Gellar benefited more from doing The Grudge than she did from 7 seasons of Buffy. I would argue it's the concept and the sell of that movie that did it. Sarah Michelle Gellar is going to see more interesting roles and more interesting opportunities as a result of that. And you look now, as we come upon When a Stranger Calls, or some of these films that are coming out now, every one of these girls goes into these movies hoping it's going to pop them in the manner Neve Campbell did, and so on and so forth. And to be honest with you, I look back going to Freddy vs. Jason, to go and get someone from Destiny's Child.
Tell me something. What kind of faggot runs around in a Christmas sweater?
Time a hugely selling R&B unit, putting them in that movie.
Freddy vs. Jason was just a permutation on the theme that worked out well.
Genre purists' arguments aside, the slasher era has left an unmistakable imprint on modern horror, visible in the work of notable directors such as Rob Zombie, Eli Roth, and James Wan.
Saw was just different and fresh because it was a completely different kind of killer.
I want to play a game.
The killer was, in essence, the victim. It was the people having to kill themselves. Of course, masterminded by Jigsaw. So he ultimately was still responsible. Anyone involved with trying to make and market a horror film these days really has a much better chance of at least getting some sort of distribution.
Why would something like Blair Witch make $120 million? You know? There are slasher movies that make a lot of dough. You know? That doesn't mean they're great. That means a lot of people are going to see them. You know? But it's just, you know, it's not for us to say whether they're good or not. I mean, it was great because it made a lot of money. No, that's not a criteria.
Started at Universal. You know, it was a movie I took to Universal Studios, pitched it to them, shot it on the Universal backlot, did everything with Universal. It was 100% a Universal film. But, you know, it came down to that fateful day when we had our first test preview. And then when the lights kind of came up and I went out to talk to the Universal execs, they all had these horrified looks on their faces. Come to my office tomorrow. That didn't sound good. But what was nice, that during the process, as the movie appeared to be more and more worthless and worthless and worthless, it made it easier and easier for me to buy it back. Because as nobody wants it, it becomes kind of like a piece of garbage that nobody wants. So in that case, I could buy it back and retain all the rights and the merchandise and everything for a steal.
It seems like there's no taboos left in the slasher films.
It's called The Devil's Rejects. So that should already cut out people that maybe don't want to see it, or House of a Thousand Corpses. I think the title isn't tricking anybody and suckering people in.
And when you see a film like Hostel with the really gruesome scenes of torture. And same thing with Wolf Creek. It used to be a mindset in Hollywood that violent films didn't make money. But the fact that Hostel opened up at $20 million, this film with nasty material could be so successful, I think shows that the audience is ready for even more extreme terror.
You know, it's always tough to predict where the slasher genre or genre in general is going.
I don't know where it can go in the future, but I mean, let's just start killing the audience.
The genre has an amazing resiliency, just like the characters in those films who take a licking and keep on ticking.
I think people like slasher movies or watch horror films because, you know, they are roller coaster rides.
It shakes you up and gives you a thrill that you don't get from, well, maybe you get it from lovemaking every now and then. Except I don't know that your hair stands on end. Other things do, but I don't know.
Horror films evoke horror, fear, terror. That's not bad. It's a true emotion. It's one we all have. You have to deal with it. Art has to deal with it.
I get the question all the time, you know, where do you get those ideas? And I just read the front page of the New York Times. Pick any day, you know? I mean, now we have, you know, a war going on where people grab people and chop their heads off right in front of a, you know, video camera and send it out to the world. I actually had an interviewer ask me, do you think Al-Qaeda got the idea of cutting off heads from watching horror movies? I said, you gotta be kidding.
People would think if you watch horror movies, it's going to make you go out and want to kill people or want to shoot people and desensitize them to violence. And we would always say, yeah, but what if you took a movie projector, went to a prison and showed Disney movies 24 hours a day? Then shouldn't that in turn have the same effect?
I think the audience today is way too sophisticated, even 12-year-olds. They've seen it all, the real gore. These soldiers who come back from the war and in pieces, you know, if you've ever seen that, that's so terrifying that nothing we can create comes close.
It's gone from something so sterile where death was not a horrible thing, it wasn't a bloody thing, to now death being really quite horrible and quite bloody and quite brutal and quite painful. My grandson, for example, seeing not how pleasant shooting somebody can be, but how horrible and ugly, you know, it should be a turn-off.
Would the world be better off without slasher films? If I had I don't think it makes the list of top 10 things the world would be better without. I think the world would be better without politicians who lie. I think the world would be better without avarice, without greed.
But I think that it's a good thing that they're maturing. They have matured in some ways.
They'll keep changing as the culture changes, as people change. They'll evolve. New talents will come along. Old talents fade away.
And, you know, horror movies should be terrifying. They should be horrible. They should be disgusting. They should be everything. You know, like when you start watering all that down, to me, I always say it's like a studio making a porno movie, but going like, we got to cut out all the sex scenes.
The slasher genre will never go anywhere. I get asked that question all the time. The answer to that question is, are there teenagers today? Will there be teenagers tomorrow? Will there be teenagers 5 years from now? If the answer is yes, slasher movies aren't going anywhere.
is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
Not in my movie.
The fans of this genre and the subgenre take so seriously, and it's one of the reasons it continues to survive.
It's a community that is unlike any other genre. You don't have conventions for comedies.
I never knew these things existed. And you take your pictures, which I never have saved pictures in my life. I've been scrounging for pictures, and then people who want autographs, oh, I got a new one that just came, and I'm going to have copies of it made, where my head is in the refrigerator with a loaf of bread and some milk, you know, and blood. And
So, I mean, I just see kids and they just remind me of me, you know, so I get it. I mean, I never think it's weird. That's why when I see someone they won't sign an autograph, I just can tell that you must have never been a fan of anything, because not signing an autograph is the most asshole-ish thing I can think of anyone doing, because they don't know that feeling of like, okay, you're gonna meet this person for 1 second, but it's gonna be a big deal to that person. You'll forget it as soon as you walk by, but they'll remember it forever. And you know, because I remember everybody I ever met that I thought was famous, and I remember who was nice and who was a douchebag.
You will see in a Chiller convention, a Fangoria convention, a Screamfest, people who just love these films, eat, sleep, and really, no pun intended, die for these movies. I mean, we're a community that just loves one another.
And it's funny, ironically enough, these fans are kind of the most ridiculed for their passion and for being such fans of something that is seen as so unseemly in the eyes of the general public, when in reality it's their passion that makes this kind of sweet, for lack of a better term. They love these characters. They see something in themselves in these characters and the people fighting them.
I grew up watching Poltergeist. It was my favorite movie. I know every line in the movie. I didn't want to, like, become that.
They identify with what's going on, and I think you know, these people aren't to be feared or mocked. These people are to be loved and kind of respected.
I think there was violence in society before horror movies, and there's going to be violence in society after horror movies. I think they're entertainment.
There is a huge female fan base in horror, and it's actually growing. Most of I call them my friends. They're not friends. My friends are mainly women. They, you know, they feel empowered.
They have a lot of great characters for women that are strong, that fight back, that kill. So I say the men beware.
Find a lot of women love and relate to these characters in horror movies.
And you couldn't have the Friday the 13th or the Halloween without the women.
And so if you're doing that for an audience who needs that, they're very loyal.
But you can lose them if you make bad stuff.